Welcome back. I am here again with one of our most popular guests, if not the most popular guest, Dr. David Morehouse. Dr. Morehouse, welcome back.
Hi, Sean. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Sorry.
All right. Now I'm gonna embarrass Dave a little bit because I've been digging around, and there's this book published in 1997 called Alien Agenda by Jim Marrs, and I had it on my bookshelf for a very, very long time, and I forgot that Dave was actually interviewed in it several times. So there is one peculiar account in this book that is extremely interesting. I don't know how much of it is true, how much of it is embellished, what the history is behind it, but on page 322, so if you all want to get the book, I'll have the link down below. You can click on it and order it. It's still in print. There's a section in a chapter called In the Mind's Eye, which is about remote viewing, UFOs, alien civilizations, etc. There's a section called Men from Mars. And in this section, there is a contention that there was an ancient Martian civilization millions of years ago that had a cataclysmic event, likely the same cataclysmic event that impacted the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, where that civilization had to go underground on Mars. And in prior episodes, we talked about remote viewing, some of the things that you saw inside Olympus Mons as an example. But also there was a contingent that made it to Earth and may, at least according to some remote viewers, have established a base or two or many bases beneath the surface. Now, in this particular piece, there are also a contention that the grays, the stereotypical gray ET that we all see, like the Whitley Strieber kind of grays,
right,
helped kind of rescue them. And then this is where it gets really, or maybe a little bit woo-woo. There's like a third group that may have been introduced called the Transcendentals, which are, according to this book, reportedly outside space and time, can alter what remote viewers see, etc. The final thing that's mentioned in this book, at least that's worth remembering or mentioning, is that these quote-unquote Martians are still here. They're a little bit annoyed. The characterization that some of the remote viewers have is that the remote viewers who view these individuals found them the most sympathetic because they described them as akin to a soldier from a first world country in an underdeveloped country, and really frustrated that the denizens of the country, or in this case planet Earth, are not managing it in a way that is intelligent, and they're kind of just screwing it up when this race allegedly fled something that was completely out of their control, like a cataclysm that was completely out of control, whereas we're kind of causing our own cataclysm. Okay, so that's a lot to unpack. I think you're quoted twice. One quote seems to me to be directly related to the work you did in Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. And I don't, people can watch that episode to get more information on that. But there is one quote later on about this civilization that we're talking about. So it just says, I'm just going to read it. Asked if these Martians are trying to take over the Earth, Morehouse replied, quote, "We don't think so. If that was their purpose, they could have done it years ago, before we developed the technology to resist. I think they are biding their time, hoping that human consciousness will evolve enough to accept the idea of sharing the planet with them. I mean, look how the races of man can't get along. What would happen if everyone suddenly became aware that Martians were among us? No, I don't. I think I think we still have further to travel on the evolutionary scale," end quote. And that's on page 325. All right. So what say you?
Well, first, Jim Marrs couches himself, positions himself. He's passed away now. I'm sorry that, he's not here. The world was a better place with him in it, I think. He was an investigative journalist, but he was also a really good storyteller. And I think that one of the things that he really perfected was the art of pulling together a lot of interview data from a lot of different sources and stitching it together into a story that was intriguing for people to read, much like what you just read there. I distinctly remember spending a lot of time with him at his farm, ranch, or whatever he was calling it, and also time seeing him in New York and visiting with him when he was there for different reasons. And we talked often about the things that we did within the remote viewing unit. And I also know that he talked to Ed Dames a lot. I don't know how many other remote viewers he talked to about this kind of stuff, but what kind of shines through in the pages as I was listening to you, I had read the book, but I read it a long time ago. And whenever I, would see things that I thought were like coming from a single source and not through multiple sources, so it wasn't really being, analyzed and codified from a bunch of different people. It was just something that was coming up from one person, and Jim was kind of running with it. I think the vast majority of what you're hearing there came from Ed Dames. I know that my quotes that I gave him there were true. And I say that same thing now to people, people running around with their hair on fire, expecting that, any knowledge of UFOs that, the government's going to be forced to turn it all over and this and that and all those things, that which I will always say it's not going to happen. And I will also say to you that if there was all this UFO presence and, that was there, then there shouldn't be any reason why they just wouldn't land right somewhere in the middle of a football stadium with 30,000 people there and pop out and go, check us out. That doesn't happen. And it's not happening for a reason. I don't doubt that they're out there, and I don't doubt that they occasionally swoop down and maybe break down or, interface on some level, or pick somebody up and, probe them and do other things to them, because look around the world we're in, and do we not pick everything up out of the ocean or a forest or anything else and do exactly the same kinds of things? So if they have the capability of interstellar travel, which I'm certain that they do, then yeah, they would do those things. They want to find out what species inhabits this planet, all of it. And so those things I don't doubt at all. I can tell you that I know where the transcendental interpretation, that was an Ed Dames interpretation. And it came from the fact that Ed and Mel Riley, I was part of that trio, but there was a lot of work that was being revealed that covered the idea that there were these alien bases underground, because there just was stuff that we found. Now, I don't know, to be perfectly honest with you, that we were not seeing something collectively being steered by our unconscious minds into what we were seeing under the earth under the surface in Mars, were we templating that through AOL to our reference of under the surface here? That could have been something that was happening. And we would have never known that. And we aren't going to know that until we actually put a manned mission to Mars on the ground and start looking under the surface there in those places where we suspect these civilizations may be, like in the lava tubes and those constructs, because there are cavities there that are the size of the island of Manhattan. And there are relics of civilizations there that have been seen by viewers, as much as that can be trusted without the feedback going on with it. I think the transcendental interpretation, albeit there is absolutely no evidence of it, we don't know. But if you'll remember in the chocolate story, we talked about the fact that we saw all sorts of things that were shooting from one portal and then disappearing into another portal. So the idea was that there may be, in that transitioning through portal to portal, dimension to dimension, that not only are there craft, but there must be beings that are in those craft. And maybe those beings are in non-physical form. And maybe that's why they're able to do what we're seeing them do. But that's just a speculation.
Right.
I mean, based on our visual observation of it. And I don't think Mel or I ever, came up with the idea of a transcendental. I think that was Ed Dames that came up with that.
There is one thing that's worth mentioning. So I did a prior interview with Lori Williams, who also knew Mel Riley pretty well. And then after Mel Riley left the unit, he was given a blind target. And what he observed was these, what they call these lava lamp beings, because they would just look like, like a lava lamp, right? You have the kind of this amorphous being that had kind of a turquoise-like color that seemed to be outside of, or just in another dimension. It was just so alien, it was difficult for him to explain. Lori Williams was tasked on the same target independently, described the same thing, and she subsequently tasked her students, again, blindly, would see these people, and all she could say is they exuded love, concern for the planet. When they were remote viewing Mars, there was a structure that they saw on Mars that looked like some sort of a transmission beacon. And when they were given the target, they said, trace the signal back to its source. And when they traced the signal back to the source, that's where they saw these beings. My guess is that these are what they refer to the transcendental beings. But again, it's just it's a supposition based on logic. But it could be something completely different.
Yeah, I mean, and you're accurate there. It's supposition, but it's flowing, going from a logic flow. And
I could be doing what Jim Mars is doing, frankly, right? It makes sense as a story, but it could be a completely different thing.
And look, I think that all of these things are okay and to embrace, but we just have to be really careful about, standing up and saying that it's all real and it's beyond a shadow of a doubt. But unfortunately, whenever you do something like that, 50% of the room is going to turn around and take it for absolute truth and face value, and then run out and start pitching it and talking it, carrying on with it. And we can't do that. As a scientist, I don't do that. And I know you don't, as a financial analyst and the things that you do, we can't do that. We can make these suppositions and speculations and interpretations, and that's all good. Physics is interpretations. The vast majority of it, particularly theoretical quantum mechanical physics, it's interpretations that can be different tomorrow. So I'm cool with looking at that stuff and hearing it and talking about it. I'm uncool with turning around and drawing a line and saying, this is it. Here's the answers. Because we don't know. We don't have feedback. So if you don't have feedback, you can't know how accurate your remote viewing sessions are or they are not. I can say.
So you certainly can't corroborate it. But when people are tasked with a similar target and they get similar results, what other logical fallacy is not the word, but what other analytical overlay type features can steer them off? Is it called telepathic overlay, where they just I don't know.
There's nothing in pure coordinate remote viewing called telepathic overlay, but all kinds of things. And so it also depends on. That's one of the reasons why in the unit it was these folders were kept for decades, and they were used over and over and over and over again. Every time another new viewer would come in, go back at it and do it again. And then maybe some of the older viewers would get up, they team together, now front loaded, and do it again and again and again. And people were looking for corroborative data, for parallels, patterns, duplicate drawings, same kinds of verbal sensory data, same kinds of visual, textual, all those things. They were looking for all that stuff. And there were a number of people. Gabrielle was one of the ones that was probably better at it, and maybe Fern was doing it as well, but Gabrielle certainly. She was really enamored of sitting down and starting to compile trending data and from different viewers over time to see what was there. So I don't know what the magic formula is for when do you start, increasing the level of expectant accuracy in data that's being derived.
I'll tell you that statistically, you need 30 samples. You need at least 30 samples. Now, that presupposes that there is no other way for them to get this information that is not pure remote viewing. So, like an analytical overlay, that's something from your information Rolodex. There's also your imagination coming into play. Now, you can rule out the imagination piece unless there's some human behavior where there's like the collective unconscious, like something related to the hundredth
Morphic
monkey
resonance
effect.
is what it's called in the collective unconscious. Yeah. And that's a very real thing that,
Right.
that plays a part in this, but even that plays a lesser part than just whether or not you really have to look back to the system that's being employed to derive this data. Is it really blind? Is it really, and is it mixed medium here? I mean, are some people not doing remote viewing, but they're doing some other thing, like I'm a natural clairvoyant, so I'm just going to do it and give you what I get.
So let's presuppose, just stepping back and just going back to first principles. Let's presuppose that independent people do a pure CRV remote viewing. Everything is done according to lab standard, perfectly done, and they report the same thing, or 30 people report the same thing about something that can't be corroborated. Now, let's say they don't do it simultaneously. Let's say one person does it first. Is there any way that person doing it first, without having any contact with anybody else, could somehow corrupt or pollute the results of the others?
From a morphic field standpoint, theoretically, yes. But it would seem to be minuscule in their ability to do that. But yeah, it could be done. But if that person has done that, has done the target and then has a notion as to what that target is, or they believe everything in their session to be accurate, and then that person turns around and sets up the next target for the next set of, let's say, coordinate remote viewers or extended remote viewers to do it. That person cannot be pure in the establishment of the concept of the targets and the coordinates to be utilized. Yes, they can. They are polluting the water. They can. That's why being a program manager or being a person that sets up coordinates, I've shared that story with you. You have to be trained and you have to be practiced to do it, because if you don't, you corrupt the session for everybody else. And I've seen it happen even in my classes, just giving somebody, I wouldn't have done it, but people who were assisting me gave somebody who had no business doing it. And then that person, drove the entire class off out into nowhere. So we had to regroup and do it again, do the whole target again. That can happen. And it's why it's such a precise protocol, whether it's ERV or CRV, it has to be done carefully, and it can't just be done willy-nilly. But let's go back to we presuppose all those things are being done correctly. Mm-hmm. And we're sticking with remote viewing, and we're not mixing it up with whatever else might, want to join in. Because I'm opposed to that. I think if whatever else wants to join in, whatever it is, if it's a room full of clairvoyance or clairaudient or clairsentience, then let them do their thing together and see what comes out of that. And then analyze between the two different methodologies, but don't mix them up together and, toss one in like the same lettuce in a salad, I guess. Best analogy I can come up with right now. It's not good science, and it's not good practice. So if it's going to be purist and you're going to do a particular form, I would even, I don't care if they're doing CRV or ERV in the same room, because they're still both working off coordinates, the same coordinate, and they both understand. An ERV performer or remote viewer rather understands what a CRV remote viewer is doing. Because they've been trained in CRV first, then they go to ERV. And it doesn't matter to me which, who's doing it or how they're doing it. They all find what they like best to work with for different reasons. But that then, as long as as you're saying, you get some statistical viability based on the number of sessions, or, if you have 10 people doing 3 sessions and you've got 30 some odd sessions now, and you throw a fourth one in for good measure, now the data that correlates and corroborates and trends, et cetera, it's good, reliable data. It was reliable data as far as the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA were concerned. It's good data in signal intelligence for the NSA, the same kinds of things, right? So right? You're just pulling all of these different intel collection methodologies and looking for the same kinds of trends and corroboration, et cetera. So yeah, that works. And you can look at it, and I think you can have a high degree of trust as long as it's being done following a set protocol. When you start mixing up the methodologies of doing it, well, then it destroys the statistical viability, because you're not using the same pool and you're not using the same methodology. You're trying different experiments and trying to see, what you can get out of it. That's how I see it from my science background anyway. But so I think that, again, going back to what I've seen and done as a remote viewer in the unit and with Ed and with O'Reilly, and certainly on occasion with Lynn Buchanan and Gabrielle, I have no doubt that those things are out there. I highly suspect that there are probably communities that are somewhere in cavernous portions of this earth that we would not even, for us, we would say from a geological science perspective, they would say it can't happen past this depth. They'd
Right.
burn up. But we're also talking about people that have mastered interstellar travel where we have not, right? So there's a lot of things that could be beneath the surface that we have no idea about. And I wouldn't say that because an oil well has not drilled through through one of their societies or something that we don't, that's proof that it doesn't exist. There are so many things that we are such an infantile state of understanding of the world and the universe and other things around us that I think it's quite egotistical to turn around and say that stuff can't possibly, exist under any conditions. I also don't know if transcendentals, if that's the appropriate word for it, but I also assume that there are things that are interdimensional that, stand outside the veil of this physical dimension and watch. I mean, if you have a belief in angels or demons or any of those kinds of things, then you have to understand that would be the realm in which they would exist, right? So certainly a lot of people that believe in those things. I know as a remote viewer that we have been able to, on occasion, perceive these dimensional beings outside. Maybe not everybody in the same way that some of us have, but some of us have seen them and interacted with them and had good experiences and bad experiences. And anyone that's ever felt the presence of something that has, frightened them, but they can't see it, they can only feel it, they sense it. Well, there's a reason for it. I mean, your radar is not coming up and the hair standing on the back of your neck because necessarily you're thinking it, you're feeling it, you're sensing that it's out there, and it is. That just on the other side, that there's good and evil, as we define it as human beings. There's positive and negative, and everything in between, and degrees of both extremes. They are out there.
I had a random thought. There's a science, kind of a weird fiction author, kind of early 20th century. His name is Algernon Blackwood, and he has a story called The Willows, and it's basically, I mean, it's 100% fiction, but it's based on that concept of being terrified by some being that you can't, or a group of beings that you can't, directly see, but they're there and they're there. And they might not be able to necessarily see you, at least I don't know about in the real world, but in the story, unless you kind of alerted them in some way, they weren't necessarily able to find the protagonist. So anyway, back to,
I'm a firm believer in that. I mean, I've had episodes in my life where I've, encountered that stuff. So, I mean, as I'm not a religious person per se anymore, but I can certainly tell you that even without a formal religious background, that I have encountered evil before, long before I ever had a religious, direction in my life, that I encountered evil. And there it exists. There is both, as I said, there's good and evil, and there's positive, negative. They're all out there. And
well, you can't have good if you don't have the contrast of evil. You can't have light without the contrast of dark. You cannot have light
if you don't understand darkness, and vice versa, right? And that's simplistically put, but it's truly put. So I have no doubt that there are these transcendental beings I don't know that they're aliens, but why would there not be?
Right.
Grays, okay. I mean, I've told you before, I never saw one. I never even saw one as a remote viewer, but I know Ron Blackburn. I don't know if he's still alive today, but Ron Blackburn was, a PhD researcher at Lawrence Livermore Air Force Base, and he was one of my remote viewing students. In fact, he went all the way through Explorer class with me, and he was not shy about, coming up to me and saying, I've been in the lab when they dissected a gray. Now, okay, I mean, I don't have any reason to believe that that a PhD, Dr. Blackburn, would make that shit up. I just don't. I don't have.
What was his first name again?
Ron Blackburn.
Ron Blackburn. Okay.
I first met him with Jacques Vallée. There was Ed and Mel and I, and we were at the Abduction Inn in New Mexico, getting ready to do the Chaco journey. Right. We just didn't know that yet. And we walked over to this one particular place because, I don't know, vantage point or something, but how we got attracted, we found each other in the darkness, but we did. And Jacques Vallée was standing there with Ron Blackburn, and Ron had all of this high speed gee whiz gear that he was like, he was tracking anomalous activity, measuring it. So he was actually measuring anomalous activity. He was always a really smart guy, and he was always, in my opinion, well-grounded, but not shy about saying some of these things about aliens at all. So I never got excited when he would say that. I mean, it's not like I would start hopping around on 1 foot or something, but it was always interesting to hear him say that. It was interesting to hear a PhD from Lawrence Livermore, working there at whatever lab he was in, to say that he had seen, touched, and observed a dissection of a deceased gray carcass.
Is that the Lawrence Livermore National Lab out by me, like in Tracy, California, near that?
Yeah, outside. Okay. It's right at the end of that pass that goes through with all those ugly windmills and generators that goes to San Francisco and Hayward, Oakland, all that.
Altamont.
Yeah, that pass. I don't remember it. Although I was at Lawrence Livermore when I was in the second grade and deemed dyslexic. My father used to take me there. That's where I actually got my training to, be able to read. Was there. There was a major that was part of kind of leading this program. And in leading that program, they had airmen who somehow got into the Air Force, but really couldn't read. They were grossly dyslexic, as was I. And they were at Lawrence Livermore, and this guy had this groundbreaking, methodology for helping dyslexics. And I was just in second grade. I don't remember how old I was, but I was in hobnobbing around the same place with all of these airmen, which I don't know if it scared me or made me feel great, but it certainly was a good place to learn. And I was really grateful for that, as was my father. But there's a lot of research that goes on there. I think there's some propulsion research that's going on there. I think there's other, biometrics and other stuff that's going on there. And he was there for a very, very long time in whatever capacity he was in there. And I really liked Ron. And like I said, he never gave me any reason to have pause about anything that he said. He wasn't the kind of guy that was self-aggrandizing or trying to stand up and make people look at him and say, oh, really? Tell us more about that. He was always kind of down on the down low about it, but he was not shy about saying it to anybody. If there were people standing in a circle, at a break during class, and the topic came up, he would say it, that I've seen and touched one. I know that they exist, kind of thing. So, golly sake, I wish I could have been there and seen that, because that would be something.
Did you see where they got it?
No. And he may have known, but I didn't ask. And I didn't ask because, I was, at the time, I was really driven toward just teaching remote viewing. And I wasn't really enamored of like chasing down rabbit holes on stuff like that, because I knew that I was not going to get there to see it. And I knew that he wasn't going to take a photograph of it and bring it to me. So I would hear it and I would, give him a hug And I'd go back to teaching class again. And I know there were a lot of people that pried into his brain for more information, but I just never pursued it.
Well, plus there are probably other students who, who told you stories that were just,
Off
like,
the wall.
they took all my teeth and, didn't give it back. Or
that was a classic, right?
Yeah, I know that wasn't in one of your classes, but I'm just, so for instance.
So I've always been really cautious about that, but again, I don't distrust him and what he said. I never would have distrusted it. And he was in class with Colonel Robert Frank, who was also at Lawrence Livermore. And this is a guy that was one of my students in San Francisco at the Veterans Building in San Francisco. And Robert passed away, I think 2 years ago now in Las Vegas. But he was another one of these guys. He was an Air Force computer guru, and so not a pilot, but was selected for promotion 3 times below the zone. That's how big his brain was. So to get selected 1 time below the zone as an Air Force officer and not be a pilot is unusual from what I hear. To do it 3 times, like major, lieutenant colonel, and colonel, is pretty phenomenal. And Robert was always supportive of Ron Blackburn, because they both came from the same place, basically. I don't know if they ever met each other there, but they both retired in Las Vegas when they retired. And I talked to Ron about Robert there many times just to catch up with them, because I would have breakfast or lunch with Robert, Colonel Frank, a lot. Both really just smart guys and very matter of fact, and not individuals prone to embellish anything for any reason whatsoever. These guys were real patriots and deep thinkers, and they were really good at what they did. And they were both good remote viewers, although they were always self-effacing and, very humble about what they did. But they both had scientific, analytical minds, and they followed the protocol, and they did well. And, I was always proud of them. And, they participated in a lot of, extracurricular things that we did. And I was always honored to have them around there. So if Ron Blackburn said he touched a gray and Colonel Frank didn't turn around and go, all BS, kind of thing, there was a mutual respect of profession there. And as I said, both super intelligent men, and both of them not prone to embellishing of anything. So I had never any reason to doubt what Ron Blackburn said. So it means then that somewhere there is proof of alien life, the physical proof of alien life. And, are we ever going to get to see that? I don't know. I guess somebody will have to decide if there's a purpose behind that. And that purpose will not be just to quell the interest of the public at large. That just won't happen.
Have you heard Lynn Buchanan's story?
No.
So I'll show you afterward. But he had a recall of an abduction experience he had 20 years hence, and I think part of it was triggered by once he started working in the remote viewing unit, he had an incident where he raised. In fact, it's recounted in the same book, by the way. And folks can watch that episode when I interviewed him.
Yeah.
But he, took him a while to recall, but apparently he assigned that target, blind as he was supposed to other remote viewers in the unit, because he wasn't sure if the memory was a real memory. And they all kind of reported the same experience. And then to just really confirm it, he went to a hypnotherapist, didn't tell him, what he was trying to remember, but went through and recalled it that way. So then I think the fourth way that he was able to confirm it was on the 7th floor at DIA headquarters. He was interviewed by 2 interrogators. They just kind of pulled him out of the lineup and they started asking him questions about his experience. So his first reaction was, oh, they're trying to see if I'm crazy so they can, declare me Section 8, send me out, right? And they were more concerned with how the craft flew. And so he just said, after they kept asking him the same questions, he's like, all right, look, here's how it works. and then started explaining it. And he said one of the interrogators, who's supposed to remain completely impassive, smiled, and he said, tapped his knee and said, I knew it. And the other interrogator got pissed off because you're not supposed to show any emotion. So, the natural conclusion of that is we have one of these things. So I didn't say that, but it seemed really odd. So
yeah, I think that, it would be, given the amount of activity that you see or hear about, that it would be unusual for us not to have some example of that. In other words, if you've got a dead gray or multiple dead grays, then you have to have whatever they showed up in, right? Unless it vaporized. And if it vaporized, they would have vaporized as well. So it has to be around somewhere. But again, it goes back to this. For me, and I know people hate this about me, but for me, that's like, so what? So I hope that we're able to reverse engineer it and do something, to develop that kind of power source, whether it's fission, fusion, because this whole battery operated world that we're in right now is just a joke. And it's just crazy. You drive a regular car for 23 years for what it costs in a carbon footprint to make one freaking Tesla. And everybody's like running around wanting to buy Teslas. Battery's not going to last. I'm telling you, it's going to be gone in 20 years because, ITARs or somebody's going to come up with this fission, fusion, perpetual energy capability. And that's what's going to power our spacecraft and, all the other things. That's what's happening. And I hope that they reverse engineer or figure out how to reverse engineer these craft and the propulsion systems in these craft, because that's the kind of thing that's going to power the world. It's not going to be what we're doing. It's not going to be wind or solar or anything else like that. That's just
I think, again, I haven't been researching this area until very recently, but my view has always been where there's smoke, there's fire. The question is there's a lot of garbage surrounding it too, like a lot of just nonsense. And it's sometimes difficult to separate the wheat from the chaff, right?
What are you talking about, John? Are you talking about just the whole thing around this alien technology or, held technology kind of thing? Yeah, I agree with you. It's the problem. That's the whole problem with the community around that, is that they're willing to chase any rabbit, mechanical or otherwise. And every time somebody steps up and says something, there's no analysis or vetting of it. They will just accept it, fit wholly, and their entire lives get wrapped around it. And
and the skeptics are the same way, right? So as an example,
just as bad. Yeah.
Yeah. If you look at the UAP videos, right? Yeah. I think one of the explanations was, those are hypersonic drones from China.
Sure.
Really? That's more terrifying than UFOs, yeah. Right? Like, is that where you're going to go with? Because if that's what you're going to go with, we're done. We might as well start learning Mandarin. Like, that's the thing I don't understand with some of these things. Like, so I think we certainly know something. The question is I could come up, again, I write science fiction, so I could come up with 100 different variations of this story, from the we know nothing angle, we don't have anything, but they're there, we just can't explain it, right? That's kind of the simple, at the very least, it is that, right? There's no other, it's not, these are just anomalous things and we don't, we're just misclassifying them. We just, I don't believe that.
And and I also want to say this about science fiction writers, is I think that science fiction writers are tapping into something in the unconscious mind that allows them to see actual craft and places and technologies. I'm a firm believer in that. In fact, I used to do that in Explorer class for my students, which was, the concept of the target would be for them to, it was an open search outward, to run into something and bring technology back. And then all of these, we had modeling clay and, Legos and you name it, right? Anything that you could get a small child to make something out of. and they would have to actually assemble this technology that they had observed in their remote viewing session. And then they would have to, in the large group or the small group, they would have to explain what it was and how it worked and what it did. Now, do I think that every piece of information that came back from that was, valid information? No, but I have no way to evaluate that. But like science fiction writers, I think that you're tapping into something. I mean, because if you look back on science fiction that was written 50 years ago, 60 years ago, much, if not all of it, is true all today. It's part of our life. The technology has now been incorporated into our life. So did that science fiction writer plant something in the head of a dreamer or an imaginarian who then turned around and, made it real? Or did this science fiction writer tap into something that was real in another place, far away, distant in space-time, evident only in the waveform expression of itself in the holographic matrix field? Did they tap into that, incorporate it into a story, and maybe embellish it with a little analytical overlay? But then that technology actually shows up in our future. So did they influence that, or did they see it and just, make a prediction of what was going to be there? Interesting, conundrum when you're looking at that, in terms of thinking about it. But I think both, and I think all of that is true.
Right. Well, since time is simultaneous.
Yeah.
Right. It's
but
by the way, incidentally, Lori Williams, a lot of her clients are historical fiction writers who use remote viewing to get details that they would not ordinarily be able to get. And, if it's real, great. If it's not, if there's analytical overlay, it doesn't matter. It's historical fiction, but it is a technique that they use to at least get a little bit more verisimilitude in their writing.
Well, I don't know, years ago, shortly after the war started, I guess, maybe about in 2002, I took a group of people to Oslo, Norway, because I was invited to be there for the Norwegian Film Institute. They had a whole bunch of screenwriters, and the whole class was filled with screenwriters, maybe 20, I guess. Not enormous, but guys and gals that were really focused, and they were looking for something. Norwegian Film Institute wanted to start making more creative, interesting films, fiction, right, et cetera. But they seemed to be against the collective Norwegian writer's block. So they actually wanted to see whether or not remote viewing could be used to help them step into a story, and as a remote viewer, begin detecting and coding and objectifying elements of that story that can then be brought out and wrapped around back in to be, part of the storyline and the screenplay. They needed, in order to develop, 1 page to equal 1 minute of screen time, they needed to have all the details in their mind to help them create that in their mind and create that dialogue to fit what was there and what was going on. And they were having a tough time doing it, which as a writer, I can understand that too, but I thought it was an ingenious use of remote viewing. Modified it, did not teach coordinate remote viewing or extended remote viewing, actually taught a brand of thought incubation, which we're going to talk about again. There'll be an episode on that, I guess, for you and I. But yeah, that was an application of that. And I think that's a grand application of it, right? So
absolutely. All right. So going back to the original premise of the episode.
Martians.
Yes. So what is your take on, given all the remote viewing sessions that you've had, is it a possibility that there's some remnants here, or is it?
I don't see why not. The civilization that was perceived and described by remote viewers on Mars was not a civilization that is as underdeveloped as we are. As sophisticated as we might think we are, they were far more sophisticated, far more developed, far more technologically sound, far more evolved as beings, it appears. But the idea that a dinosaur world-ending event, that again is, I believe, an interpretation that came from Ed Dames. Ed, among other things, had a big interest in geology and astrology and those kinds of things. And so sometimes those things would get stitched together as just descriptions, right? He was trying to say, this is what we think this could be. And it doesn't mean he's wrong. It just means I know where that came from just hearing it. Could they be around and amongst us? And is there a connection between here and there? I definitely believe there's a connection between here and there. And I understand why there would not be a connection on the moon. The moon is essentially a dead planet, lots of minerals and other things that they can extract from that place. But whenever they get up there to do that and mine it, which I'm surprised it hadn't started to happen yet, it offers far less than Mars did, and when Mars was viable and alive. And the Earth has always, I think, offered a great deal of life or life potential. And I don't understand in any way, shape, or form why they would not have been capable from going from there to here. I mean, we're now getting ready to go from here to there. So the idea that they would not have colonized both places, to me, doesn't pass the logic stream, right? Of course they would have. I mean, if they were there, they could look back here. And if they were as advanced as we believe they were, then the idea that you wouldn't be here to colonize something, or if that planet was dying to send something here, why they wouldn't have just intermingled and interbred with the humans that were here as a species, I don't know the answer to that.
Maybe they did.
Maybe they did. Yeah, maybe they did. We would not know the difference, would we? We would not know the difference. Yeah. So perhaps that did happen. And perhaps that's why, there was this sudden leap in transition from Neanderthal, that kind of thing, into a more modernized species with higher levels of thinking and tool making and, of course, warring that started to show up, right?
Speaking of which, have you ever done 23andMe where you got your genome mapped and it says like you have this? Have you?
Yeah.
Is there a section called Other on that report?
Yeah, but I always took that to mean like indeterminate geographical location, for a species. Usually meaning that it might have come out of North Africa or something like that, maybe in the Middle East or something.
Okay, so hear me out, and I'm not going to attribute it on the call. I will tell you afterward. Okay.
Yeah.
Here's what I heard about that. The company does not know what is in that other category. They have no idea. And there is someone that there is someone or some agency in the government that is very interested in identifying what that is. The company doesn't know. It is part that part of the genome is untraceable.
I just put that down as a research topic for me.
Definitely follow.
Thank you very much. I'll spend the next 5 days trying to figure out what that means. So, thanks for the nightmare. So. Yeah. I was always just cool with the fact that it just meant that they couldn't figure out a geographical location for the origin of that particular genome. But okay. So yeah.
Well, I mean, that is true, but they don't they can't trace it to anywhere.
Could be subsurface. Could be subsurface, right? Or any of the other things we've been talking about. Hey, I'm open to the fascination of it. Perhaps not the reality of it, but I'm open to, looking at it and giving it good thought and good discussion. Really. I mean, I am. I mean, I think that I'm very curious about that now.
Yeah. Or it just could be a technical deficiency, right? Who knows? Right.
Yeah. Perhaps. Yeah. Well,
all right. I'll end it on that note, tantalizing note, so that people can call all the people that they, that work at 23andMe. And, by the way, I used to work with somebody, and this is not where that came from, who had worked at 23andMe, but she's a lawyer, so she probably wouldn't say anything anyway. So
that's definitely in the other category.
Yeah, lawyer. Exactly. So. Exactly. All right. Thank you very much, my friend. And I look forward to speaking with you on a future episode.
Yeah. Bye, everybody. Thanks, Sean.
If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.